I should have known the moment those steel-gray eyes locked onto mine across the courtroom that my life was about to shatter into 1,000 irreparable pieces, each one cutting deeper than the last as they fell around me like broken glass. The defendant, some nobody named Marcus Chen, according to the case files that had been shoved into my hands just minutes before I was called to testify, sat perfectly still in his chair, his posture so controlled and precise that it seemed almost inhuman, as if he had been carved from marble rather than born of flesh and blood. But those eyes, those impossibly cold and calculating eyes that seemed to see straight through to my very soul, they held secrets darker than the murky waters of the East River that had swallowed his victim whole on that terrible night 3 months ago. My name is Sarah Blackwood, and I never intended to become the star witness in what everyone assured me was just another routine murder trial, the kind that filled the dockets of Manhattan's criminal courts day after day, like a relentless tide of human misery and violence. At 26, I had built a comfortable, predictable life as a forensic accountant, spending my days buried in spreadsheets and financial records, tracking down embezzled funds and fraudulent transactions for corporate clients who paid me well to remain invisible and thorough. The work suited me perfectly. Numbers don't lie, they don't manipulate, and they certainly don't threaten to destroy everything you hold dear with a single glance across a crowded courtroom. The irony wasn't lost on me that my obsession with order and predictability had led me to witness something so chaotic and brutal that it would forever change the trajectory of my carefully planned existence. It had been a Tuesday night in September, one of those unseasonably warm evenings when the city seems to pulse with restless energy, and I was walking home from my office in Lower Manhattan, taking my usual route along the waterfront, because the sight of the river at night had always calmed my racing mind after long days spent untangling other people's financial disasters. The streets were mostly empty, save for the occasional jogger or late-night dog walker, and I was lost in thought about a particularly complex case involving a tech startup's missing venture capital when I heard the distinctive sound of a car door slamming, echoing off the concrete barriers that separated the walkway from the water. What I witnessed next would be burned into my memory forever, playing on an endless loop during sleepless nights, and haunting my dreams with such vivid clarity that sometimes I wondered if I was losing my grip on reality. A man, tall, broad-shouldered, moving with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to violence, emerged from the driver's side of a black sedan that gleamed like oil under the streetlights, its windows tinted so dark that they seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. He moved to the trunk with purpose, his movements economical and practiced, and when he opened it, the metallic smell of blood mixed with something chemical and sharp hit me even from 50 yards away, carried on the night breeze like a warning I should have heeded. The bundle he lifted from the trunk was unmistakably human-shaped, wrapped in what appeared to be industrial plastic sheeting that caught and reflected the amber glow of the street lamps as he carried it toward the water's edge with the casual ease of someone disposing of trash rather than a human life. I should have run, should have turned around and walked away as quickly and quietly as possible, should have pretended I never saw anything and continued living my safe, boring life surrounded by numbers that made sense and people who followed predictable patterns. Instead, I found myself frozen in place, my feet rooted to the concrete, as if the weight of what I was witnessing had created some kind of gravitational pull that held me captive while my rational mind screamed at me to flee. The sound the body made when it hit the water, a heavy splash followed by an almost musical gurgling as the current caught it and began to pull it away from shore, would echo in my ears for weeks afterward, a haunting soundtrack to my growing paranoia and sleepless nights. The man stood at the water's edge for several long moments, watching as his burden disappeared into the darkness, and even from my hiding spot behind a concrete pillar, I could see the satisfaction in his posture, the way he rolled his shoulders as if he had just completed a particularly satisfying workout rather than committed what I was certain was murder. When he finally turned to walk back to his car, the streetlight illuminated his face for just a moment, but it was enough for me to memorize every detail. The sharp angles of his cheekbones, the strong line of his jaw. The way his dark hair was perfectly styled despite the late hour and the physical exertion of his grim task. He was handsome in a way that seemed almost designed to be memorable, with features that belonged on magazine covers rather than police sketches. And I found myself wondering how someone so striking could move through the world committing such terrible acts without being noticed and stopped. The rational part of my brain, the part that had been trained to analyze evidence and follow logical conclusions, told me that I had just witnessed a murder and that it was my civic duty to report what I had seen to the authorities, regardless of the personal cost or potential danger. The primal, survival-oriented part of my brain whispered urgent warnings about getting involved with the kind of people who disposed of bodies like they were taking out the garbage. But in the end, my conscience won the battle, just as it always did when faced with questions of right and wrong. The next morning, I called the police and reported what I had witnessed, providing them with a detailed description of the man, his car, and the location where the body had been dumped. Within hours, the area was swarming with divers and crime scene technicians, and by the end of the week, they had recovered what remained of Maria Santos, a 28-year-old cocktail waitress who had been missing for 6 days, and whose family had been desperately searching for any sign of what had happened to their beloved daughter and sister. The investigation moved with surprising speed, and within 2 weeks, the man I had seen disposing of Maria's body was arrested and charged with her murder. Marcus Chen, according to the newspapers and court documents, was a small-time criminal with connections to various illegal gambling operations, exactly the kind of person who might kill someone over a debt or a perceived slight, and then dispose of the evidence in the most expedient way possible. The media coverage portrayed him as a dangerous but ultimately ordinary criminal, another sad story of urban violence that would be forgotten as soon as the next tragedy captured the public's attention. But now, sitting in this witness box with those steel-gray eyes boring into me like laser beams, I realized that everything I had been told about Marcus Chen was a carefully constructed lie, and that the man staring at me with such intense focus was something far more dangerous than a simple street-level thug. His suit, for starters, was clearly custom-tailored and probably cost more than I made in 3 months, the kind of garment that spoke of serious money and refined tastes, rather than the cheap, off-the-rack clothing I would expect from a small-time criminal. His posture was too controlled, too confident, radiating the kind of authority that comes from having real power, rather than the desperate bravado of someone trying to prove themselves in a world that had already written them off. The way the court officers moved around him was another red flag that my analytical mind couldn't ignore. They gave him slightly more space than necessary, their body language suggesting a wariness that went beyond standard protocol for dangerous defendants. Even his lawyer, a sharp-dressed woman whose reputation for defending high-profile clients was legendary in legal circles, seemed to defer to him in subtle ways that suggested their relationship was far more complex than a simple attorney-client arrangement. As I recounted the events of that September night, describing in meticulous detail everything I had witnessed from my hiding place behind the concrete pillar, I found myself fighting the growing certainty that I had made a terrible mistake in agreeing to testify. The prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Jennifer Walsh, had assured me that my testimony was crucial for securing a conviction, and that the defendant posed no particular threat beyond the standard risks associated with any violent criminal. But the man sitting across from me radiated a kind of controlled menace that made my skin crawl and my instincts scream danger. His attention never wavered, not even when his lawyer objected to questions about his background or when the prosecutor showed graphic crime scene photos that made several jury members visibly uncomfortable. Those gray eyes remained fixed on me with an intensity that felt almost physical, as if he was memorizing every detail of my face, my voice, my mannerisms, filing them away for future reference in a way that made my blood run cold despite the warm temperature of the courtroom. When I finished my testimony and stepped down from the witness stand, my legs trembling slightly from the adrenaline and stress of the past 2 hours, I caught one final glimpse of Marcus Chen, or whoever he really was, and what I saw in his expression made my heart skip several beats in rapid succession. It wasn't anger or hatred, emotions I might have expected from someone facing life in prison based on my testimony, but rather a look of cold calculation, as if he was already 3 moves ahead in a chess game I didn't even know we were playing. The bailiff escorted me from the courtroom through a side door, following standard procedure for protecting witnesses from potential retaliation. But as we walked down the narrow hallway toward the exit, I couldn't shake the feeling that leaving the relative safety of the public courtroom had somehow made me more vulnerable rather than less. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting strange shadows on the institutional green walls, and our footsteps echoed with a hollow sound that seemed to emphasize just how alone and exposed I was in this sterile government building. "You did great in there," the bailiff, a middle-aged man named Officer Rodriguez, said as we reached the exit, his tone professionally reassuring, but lacking any real conviction that might have actually comforted me. "The jury was definitely paying attention, and your testimony was clear and compelling. This guy's going away for a long time thanks to you." I nodded and managed what I hoped was a grateful smile. But as I stepped out into the late afternoon sunlight and began the walk to the subway station that would take me home to my apartment in Brooklyn, I couldn't escape the growing certainty that my real problems were just beginning. The man in that courtroom, whatever his real name might be, had looked at me not like someone who was defeated, but like someone who was already planning his next move. And I had the sinking feeling that when that move came, I would be completely unprepared for the storm that was about to engulf my carefully ordered life. As I descended into the subway tunnel, surrounded by the familiar chaos of rush-hour commuters and the rhythmic clatter of approaching trains, I tried to convince myself that I was being paranoid, that the stress of testifying had made me imagine threats that didn't really exist. But deep in my chest, a cold knot of fear was already beginning to form, and no amount of rational self-talk could make it disappear. Something told me that by the time I woke up tomorrow morning, my world would be a very different and much more dangerous place than it had been when I climbed out of bed that morning, blissfully unaware that I was about to come face to face with the kind of evil that most people only encounter in their worst nightmares. The morning light filtering through my bedroom curtains should have been comforting and warm, carrying with it the promise of another ordinary day, filled with spreadsheets and financial reports, and all the mundane tasks that had once comprised the entirety of my predictable existence. But instead it felt harsh and unforgiving against my sleep-deprived eyes as I struggled to shake off the restless dreams that had plagued me throughout the night. I had tossed and turned for hours, my subconscious mind replaying the events of the previous day over and over again like a broken film reel, each iteration bringing with it fresh waves of anxiety about what I had witnessed in that courtroom and what it might mean for my future safety and peace of mind. The coffee maker gurgled to life in my small kitchen as I went through the motions of my usual morning routine. But even the familiar ritual of grinding beans and measuring water couldn't calm the nervous energy that had been building in my chest since I first opened my eyes, a tight knot of apprehension that seemed to grow larger and more insistent with each passing minute. Something felt fundamentally wrong with the world around me, as if the very air had shifted overnight and was now charged with an electric tension that made my skin crawl and my nerves sing with alarm, though I couldn't quite put my finger on what exactly had changed, or why my instincts were screaming at me to be afraid. The first concrete sign that my paranoia might be justified came when I pulled back the sheer curtains in my living room to check the weather, and found myself staring down at a scene that belonged in a crime thriller, rather than the quiet residential street in Brooklyn Heights, where I had lived peacefully for the past 3 years. 3 black SUVs with tinted windows so dark they seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it were parked at strategic intervals along the block, their massive frames and aggressive styling making my neighbors' sedans and compact cars look like toys by comparison. And even from my 4th-floor window, I could see that they were occupied by figures who remained perfectly still behind those impenetrable windows. My breath caught in my throat as the implications of what I was seeing began to sink in. and I found myself backing away from the window, as if the simple act of observing these vehicles might somehow draw their attention and confirm whatever suspicions had brought them to my quiet corner of the city. The rational part of my mind tried to convince me that I was overreacting, that the presence of these cars was probably just a coincidence, perhaps some kind of security detail for a visiting dignitary, or a film crew setting up for a movie shoot. But the primal, survival-oriented part of my brain was already flooding my system with adrenaline and preparing my body for fight or flight. When I forced myself to look again, this time from a different angle that would be harder to detect from the street below, I noticed additional details that made my blood run cold and confirmed my worst fears about the nature of these unexpected visitors. Men in dark suits stood at each end of the block, their postures alert and professional in a way that suggested military or law enforcement training, and they were clearly positioned to monitor and control access to the area rather than simply waiting for someone or something to arrive. One of them, a tall figure with broad shoulders and the kind of stillness that comes from years of practice in surveillance, turned his head slightly in my direction as I peered through the gap in my curtains. And though I was certain he couldn't actually see me from that distance and angle, something about his movement made me feel as though I had been spotted and catalogued. The true scope of my predicament became clear when I tried to use my phone to call the police, only to discover that the device was completely dead, despite having been fully charged when I went to bed the night before. The screen remained black, no matter how many times I pressed the power button, and when I connected it to the charger, there was no indication that it was receiving power or attempting to turn on, as if someone had somehow disabled it remotely or tampered with it while I slept. The landline phone that I kept for emergencies, a relic from my college days that I had never bothered to disconnect, was similarly useless, producing only silence when I lifted the receiver, instead of the familiar dial tone that should have connected me to the outside world. Panic began to set in as I realized that I was completely cut off from any means of communication or calling for help, trapped in my own apartment like a mouse in a maze while unknown forces gathered outside my door with intentions that I didn't dare contemplate too closely. The walls that had once provided comfort and security now felt like a prison, and every sound from the hallway outside, the hiss of the elevator arriving at my floor, footsteps in the corridor, the distant murmur of voices, made my heart race and my palms sweat as I wondered if my mysterious watchers were already moving to tighten their net around me. The knock on my door, when it finally came, was neither urgent nor threatening, just 3 measured raps that somehow managed to convey more menace than a violent pounding would have, as if the person on the other side was so confident in their position that they felt no need to rush or force their way inside. I approached the door on trembling legs, my bare feet silent on the hardwood floor as I moved to peer through the peephole, and what I saw in the distorted fisheye view made my breath catch in my throat and my knees threatened to give way beneath me. The man standing in my hallway was tall and lean, with the kind of casual elegance that suggested expensive tastes and unlimited resources. His perfectly tailored charcoal suit and Italian leather shoes marking him as someone who moved in circles far removed from my middle-class existence. His face was angular and sharp, with high cheekbones and a strong jaw that would have made him handsome under different circumstances. But his eyes were what truly terrified me. Pale blue and utterly cold, devoid of any warmth or humanity, as they stared directly at the peephole as if he knew I was watching him and wanted me to see the emptiness behind his gaze. "Miss Blackwood," he said, his voice carrying easily through the solid oak door, despite being pitched at a conversational level. The slight accent that colored his words, suggesting Eastern European origins, and adding an exotic menace to his polite tone. "My name is Victor Petrov, and I represent certain business interests that were affected by your testimony yesterday. I think it would be in everyone's best interest if we could have a brief conversation about your recent courthouse appearance and discuss some options that might be mutually beneficial for all parties involved." The careful formality of his words did nothing to disguise the underlying threat that ran through every syllable, and I found myself pressing my back against the wall, beside the door, as if putting a few extra inches between myself and this stranger might somehow provide additional protection from whatever he had planned. Every instinct I possessed was screaming at me not to open that door, to barricade myself inside and wait for help that might never come. But the knowledge that I was completely trapped with no way to contact the outside world made resistance feel futile and potentially dangerous. "I know you're there, Miss Blackwood," Victor continued when I failed to respond, his tone remaining perfectly calm and reasonable, even as the implicit threat became more pronounced. "And I know you're frightened, which is entirely understandable given the circumstances. However, I want to assure you that my employer has no desire to harm you unnecessarily, provided you're willing to listen to what we have to offer and consider the alternatives we're prepared to present." The mention of alternatives sent another chill down my spine, because in the context of organized crime, and I was becoming increasingly certain that was exactly what I was dealing with, alternatives usually meant choosing between cooperating and dying, with very little middle ground for negotiation or compromise. The careful way Victor spoke, with its emphasis on business interests and mutual benefits, was the kind of language used by people who had learned to discuss violence and coercion in terms that sounded reasonable and civilized, even when the underlying reality was anything but. "Perhaps it would help to motivate your decision-making process," Victor said after another long pause, his voice taking on a slightly different quality that made my blood freeze in my veins. "If you were aware that we have comprehensive surveillance on all the people you care about, including your younger sister Maya, who I believe is currently a junior at Columbia University, studying biochemistry with dreams of attending medical school after graduation." The casual mention of my sister's name and personal details hit me like a physical blow, driving the air from my lungs and making the world spin around me as I realized that these people had done their homework thoroughly and were prepared to use my loved ones as leverage to ensure my cooperation. Maya was everything to me, the only family I had left after our parents died in a car accident 5 years earlier, and the thought of her becoming collateral damage in whatever deadly game I had inadvertently stumbled into was more terrifying than any threat they could make against my own life. "She has constitutional law at 10:30 this morning," Victor continued, his voice maintaining that same pleasant conversational tone as he demonstrated the depth of their knowledge about my personal life, followed by organic chemistry lab at 2 o'clock. And she usually stops by that little coffee shop on Amsterdam Avenue between classes to work on her research papers. Such a dedicated student, and so trusting in the basic goodness of the world around her, it would be truly unfortunate if that innocence were to be shattered by circumstances beyond her control. The photographs he slid under my door while he spoke were like daggers to my heart. Glossy 8x10 prints that showed Maya walking across campus with her backpack slung over her shoulder, completely unaware that she was being watched and documented by professional stalkers who could reach out and destroy her life at any moment. The images were recent, probably taken within the past few days, and the quality was professional enough to suggest expensive equipment and skilled operators, the kind of surveillance apparatus that could only be maintained by organizations with serious resources and extensive experience in intimidation and control. "You have 24 hours to recant your testimony," Victor said, as I knelt on the floor beside the door, my hands shaking as I picked up the photographs and stared at my sister's smiling face, completely oblivious to the danger that now surrounded both of us, like a tightening noose. "And to sign an affidavit stating that you were mistaken in your identification of the defendant, and that the lighting conditions and distance made accurate observation impossible. The district attorney's office will be disappointed, of course, but without your testimony, their case becomes significantly weaker and reasonable doubt becomes much easier to establish." The rational part of my mind understood that what he was asking me to do would essentially free a murderer and pervert the course of justice, allowing someone who had killed Maria Santos and disposed of her body like garbage to walk away from his crimes without consequence. The protective, desperate part of my mind that was focused entirely on keeping Maya safe whispered that the choice was obvious, that one dead stranger wasn't worth risking my sister's life, and that I could live with the guilt of letting a killer go free if it meant protecting the only person left in the world who truly mattered to me. The alternative, Victor said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than a shout would have, is that both you and your sister will discover just how creative my employer can be when it comes to expressing his displeasure with people who interfere in his business operations. I'm told that he has quite an imagination when it comes to making examples of those who cross him, and that he particularly enjoys demonstrating the consequences of betrayal to anyone who might be considering similar acts of defiance in the future. The sound of his footsteps retreating down the hallway was almost anticlimactic after the intensity of his visit, but the silence he left behind was somehow worse than his presence had been, filled with the weight of impossible choices and the knowledge that my comfortable, predictable life had been irrevocably shattered by forces beyond my control or understanding. I remained on the floor beside the door for what felt like hours, clutching those photographs of Maya and trying to process the magnitude of what had just happened and what it meant for both of our futures. When I finally found the courage to look out the window again, the black SUVs were still there, patient and menacing in their silent vigil, and I realized with growing horror that this wasn't some temporary intimidation tactic that would end once I made my choice about the testimony. These people, whoever they really were, had made me their problem, and experience suggested that organized crime syndicates didn't simply walk away from problems, they eliminated them permanently, regardless of whether those problems cooperated or not. The photograph that Victor had left behind with the others was smaller and grainier than the campus surveillance shots, clearly taken with a telephoto lens from a significant distance. But what it showed made my heart stop completely and confirmed my worst fears about the true scope of the trap that had been carefully constructed around me. It was Maya leaving her dorm that very morning, her familiar blue backpack slung over her shoulder and her dark hair catching the early sunlight. But what made the image truly terrifying was the figure visible in the background, a man in a dark jacket who was clearly following her at a discreet distance, his body, language, and positioning marking him as professional surveillance despite the casual nature of his clothing and demeanor. The message was crystal clear. They had my sister under active surveillance right now, at this very moment, and if I made the wrong choice or tried to seek help from law enforcement, Maya would pay the price for my defiance before I could even begin to warn her about the danger she was in. The hours that followed Victor's visit stretched like an eternity of torment and indecision, each minute crawling by with agonizing slowness as I paced the confines of my apartment like a caged animal, weighing impossible choices and trying to find some solution that didn't involve either betraying my principles or sacrificing my sister's safety on the altar of justice for a woman I had never met, but whose murder I had witnessed with my own terrified eyes. The black SUVs remained in position outside my building like silent sentinels of doom, their occupants invisible behind those impenetrable windows, but their presence serving as a constant reminder that I was being watched and evaluated with every breath I took. Every decision I made or failed to make in the crushing weight of this impossible situation. The affidavit that Victor had left behind sat on my coffee table like a coiled snake, its legal language carefully crafted to sound plausible and reasonable while completely undermining everything I had sworn to under oath just 24 hours earlier, transforming my clear and detailed testimony into the confused ramblings of an unreliable witness who had been too far away and operating under too poor lighting conditions to accurately identify anyone or anything. Reading through its professionally written paragraphs made my stomach turn with revulsion and shame, knowing that signing my name to such a document would not only free a cold-blooded killer, but would also make me complicit in whatever future violence he might commit once he was back on the streets, with the knowledge that witnesses could be intimidated into silence. As the afternoon sun tracked across my living room windows, casting long shadows that seemed to grow darker and more ominous with each passing hour, I found myself alternating between moments of desperate resolve to stand firm in my testimony, regardless of the consequences, and periods of overwhelming terror at the thought of what these people might do to Maya if I refused to cooperate with their demands. The photographs of my sister remained spread across my kitchen counter like tarot cards predicting a terrible future, her innocent smile and carefree posture serving as a painful reminder of how much I stood to lose if I made the wrong choice in this deadly game that I had never intended to join. The sound of footsteps in the hallway outside my apartment around 7 o'clock that evening sent my heart racing and my hands trembling as I realized that my time for deliberation had been cut short, that whoever was responsible for orchestrating this elaborate intimidation campaign had apparently decided that waiting until the full 24 hours had elapsed was unnecessary when the outcome was already predetermined by the simple mathematics of leverage and fear. The knock on my door when it came was different this time, not the measured professional rapping that Victor had employed earlier, but something more confident and authoritative, as if the person on the other side knew beyond any doubt that I would open the door and submit to whatever they had planned for this encounter. Looking through the peephole revealed a sight that made my breath catch in my throat, and my legs threatened to give way beneath me, because standing in my hallway with the casual confidence of someone who owned not just the building, but the entire world around it, was the man I had testified against less than 48 hours earlier. No longer dressed in the simple orange jumpsuit of a county jail prisoner, but wearing an impeccably tailored black suit that probably cost more than my annual salary, and radiating an aura of controlled power that made it impossible to believe he had ever been anything other than exactly what he was: a predator at the apex of a criminal food chain that stretched far beyond anything I had ever imagined possible. Marcus Chen, or whoever he really was beneath that carefully constructed identity, stood perfectly still in my hallway, as if he had all the time in the world to wait for me to make the obvious choice and open the door. His posture relaxed, but alert in the way of someone who was accustomed to getting exactly what he wanted from every interaction and every negotiation he entered into. The two men flanking him were clearly bodyguards, their bulk and alertness marking them as professionals who would respond to any threat with immediate and overwhelming violence. But it was the man in the center who commanded attention and respect, his very presence seeming to bend the air around him like gravity, warping space-time around a massive celestial object. "Miss Blackwood?" he said, his voice carrying clearly through the door, despite being pitched at a conversational level. The slight accent I detected adding an exotic sophistication to his words that somehow made them even more threatening than Victor's earlier pronouncements. "I believe we have some unfinished business to discuss, and I think you'll find that face-to-face conversation is much more productive than the indirect communication methods we've been forced to employ thus far. I give you my word that no harm will come to you during our meeting, provided you're willing to listen to what I have to offer and consider the alternatives that are available to both of us." The promise of safety rang hollow given the circumstances of our acquaintance and the methods his organization had already employed to demonstrate their reach and capabilities. But the knowledge that Maya was still somewhere out, there in the city, probably unaware that her every movement was being monitored by professional killers who could eliminate her without warning or mercy, made the choice to open the door feel inevitable rather than voluntary. My hands shook as I turned the deadbolt and removed the security chain, actions that felt like signing my own death warrant, but which seemed preferable to forcing these people to take more aggressive measures to gain access to my apartment and my cooperation. The man who entered my living space moved with the fluid grace of a predator surveying new territory, his steel-gray eyes taking in every detail of my modest furnishings and personal belongings, as if he was cataloging potential weaknesses or sources of leverage that might prove useful in future negotiations. Up close, he was even more imposing than he had appeared in the courtroom, his physical presence filling the room in a way that made my apartment feel suddenly cramped and inadequate, like a dollhouse that had been built to accommodate children rather than adults who operated on the scale of life and death, rather than ordinary human concerns and considerations. "Allow me to introduce myself properly," he said, settling into my favorite armchair with the casual assumption of ownership that marked him as someone who was accustomed to taking what he wanted without asking permission. or acknowledging the rights of others. Since the identity I was forced to assume for legal proceedings doesn't accurately reflect either my true nature or the scope of my business interests. My name is Dante Kozlov, and I have the honor of leading one of the most successful and respected criminal organizations on the East Coast, a family business that has been operating in various forms for over 70 years. The casual way he described his criminal enterprise, as if he was discussing a legitimate corporation or a respected charitable foundation, was somehow more chilling than outright threats would have been, because it suggested a level of confidence and institutional support that went far beyond what any street-level criminal could hope to achieve or maintain. This was clearly someone who operated with virtual impunity, protected by layers of corruption and influence that reached into every level of government and law enforcement, making him effectively untouchable by conventional means of justice and accountability. Your testimony yesterday, Dante continued, his tone remaining conversational and almost friendly, despite the underlying menace that colored every word he spoke, while admirably detailed and convincingly delivered, threatens to unravel several years of careful planning and strategic positioning that have allowed my organization to operate with minimal interference from law enforcement agencies. The identity of Marcus Chen, while ultimately disposable, served important purposes in our overall operational security, and losing that particular asset at this particular time would create complications that I prefer to avoid if possible. The way he discussed the murder I had witnessed, as if Maria Santos had been nothing more than a minor inconvenience in his larger business operations, made my stomach turn with revulsion and renewed determination to see justice done. But the knowledge that my sister's life hung in the balance of this conversation forced me to swallow my outrage and listen to whatever proposition he had come here to offer. The photographs of Maya still lay scattered across my coffee table where I had left them, and Dante's eyes lingered on them for a moment, before returning to my face with an expression that might have been sympathy if it had been displayed by anyone other than a cold-blooded killer. However, he said, leaning forward slightly in his chair, as if he was about to share a particularly interesting confidence with a trusted friend, rather than threatening a terrified witness into submission. I've given considerable thought to our mutual predicament, and I believe there may be a solution that serves both of our interests, while avoiding the unpleasant alternatives that my associate Mr. Petrov outlined during his earlier visit. You see, Miss Blackwood, your background in forensic accounting represents a skill set that could prove extremely valuable to my organization, particularly as we work to modernize and legitimize certain aspects of our business operations. The suggestion that I might somehow become an employee of the very criminal enterprise whose crimes I had witnessed and reported to the authorities was so absurd and offensive that I almost laughed out loud. But the serious expression on Dante's face and the presence of his armed bodyguards reminded me that this was not a situation where incredulous laughter would be either appropriate or safe for my continued survival. The idea that he expected me to willingly participate in money laundering and financial fraud on behalf of people who had threatened my sister and destroyed my peace of mind showed a level of arrogance and entitlement that was almost breathtaking in its audacity. The position I have in mind, Dante continued, apparently interpreting my stunned silence as interested consideration rather than horrified disbelief, would involve working closely with my financial advisors and legal team to develop more sophisticated methods of integrating our various revenue streams into legitimate business enterprises, creating a cleaner and more sustainable operational model that reduces our exposure to law enforcement scrutiny, while maximizing our profit potential and market penetration in emerging sectors of the economy. The euphemistic language he used to describe what was clearly an extensive criminal conspiracy made my head spin with the sheer scope of what he was proposing, and I began to understand that the man sitting in my living room was not some ordinary street criminal or even a traditional organized crime boss, but rather someone who operated on a scale that encompassed multiple industries and possibly multiple countries, wielding influence and resources that dwarfed anything I had ever imagined possible in the shadowy underworld of illegal enterprise. In exchange for your expertise and cooperation, Dante said, his voice taking on a warmer, more persuasive tone as he outlined the terms of what he clearly considered to be a generous offer. You and your sister would enjoy the protection and financial security that comes with being valued members of my extended family, along with the knowledge that your contributions are helping to build something larger and more significant than the small, safe life you've been living up until now. The work would be challenging and well compensated, and you would have access to resources and opportunities that most people can only dream about. The casual mention of Maya as part of this devil's bargain made my blood run cold, because it confirmed what I had already suspected, that refusing his offer would not simply result in my own death, but would also doom my innocent sister to whatever fate these monsters deemed appropriate for the family members of uncooperative witnesses. The protection he offered was clearly conditional on my complete submission to his will, and the financial security he promised would come at the cost of my soul and my participation in crimes that would destroy other innocent lives. Of course, Dante added, his tone shifting slightly to acknowledge the elephant in the room that we had both been carefully avoiding throughout this surreal negotiation. Your current legal obligations would need to be addressed in a satisfactory manner before any new arrangements could be finalized. The affidavit that Mr. Petrov provided offers a reasonable solution to that particular challenge, allowing you to correct your earlier testimony without raising undue suspicion about your motivations or the circumstances surrounding your change of heart. The way he phrased it made signing a false statement recanting my testimony sound like a minor administrative detail rather than a complete betrayal of everything I believed in. And I realized that this was how people like Dante Kozlov operated, by making the unthinkable seem reasonable and the impossible appear inevitable through a combination of overwhelming pressure and carefully crafted justifications that allowed their victims to rationalize their own surrender and collaboration. When I finally found my voice after several long minutes of stunned silence, the words that came out of my mouth surprised me with their steadiness and clarity, because despite the terror that was coursing through my veins and the knowledge that I was probably signing my own death warrant, I discovered that there were still some lines I was not willing to cross, regardless of the consequences that might follow from my defiance. "And if I refuse?" I asked, meeting his steel-gray eyes with what I hoped was a steady gaze despite the way my hands were trembling in my lap. "What happens to Maya and me if I decide that I'd rather take my chances with whatever alternatives you have in mind than become a willing participant in your criminal organization?" The smile that spread across Dante's face in response to my question was neither cruel nor threatening, but rather something far more disturbing. The expression of someone who was genuinely pleased to discover that his new acquisition possessed the kind of backbone and moral conviction that would make her eventual submission all the more satisfying and complete when it finally came. 3 weeks into what I had come to think of as my captivity, though Dante insisted on calling it my employment transition period, with the kind of dark humor that seemed to characterize everything about his approach to what most people would consider horrific circumstances, I found myself seated in the opulent library of his Westchester estate, surrounded by first-edition volumes of Machiavelli and Sun Tzu that served as both decoration and philosophical foundation for a criminal empire that operated with the precision and ruthlessness of a multinational corporation. The irony of my situation was not lost on me as I worked through spreadsheets filled with numbers that represented human trafficking routes disguised as shipping manifests, weapons sales camouflaged as agricultural equipment exports, and drug distribution networks hidden within legitimate pharmaceutical supply chains, all while my captor sat across from me reading Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, with the kind of absorbed concentration that suggested genuine intellectual engagement rather than mere performance. The estate itself was a monument to tasteful excess and carefully cultivated refinement, with its sweeping lawns and classical architecture serving as a perfect facade for the darkness that lay beneath the surface of Dante's carefully constructed world. Every detail had been chosen with meticulous attention to projecting an image of legitimacy and respectability, from the museum-quality artwork that adorned the walls to the library where we now spent most of our working hours, creating an environment that made it easy to forget that the man who owned all of this beauty had built his fortune on violence and exploitation, until something would happen to remind me that I was living in the lair of a predator rather than the home of a refined gentleman. The transformation in my daily routine had been gradual but profound, with Dante slowly introducing me to the scope and complexity of his operations while maintaining the fiction that I was there by choice rather than coercion. Though the presence of armed guards at every entrance and the knowledge that Maya was still under constant surveillance served as constant reminders of the true nature of our arrangement. He had moved me into the estate's guest wing after the first week, claiming that the commute from my Brooklyn apartment was inefficient and that the security arrangements would be simpler if I were on the premises. But I understood that this was simply another layer of control designed to isolate me from the outside world and make resistance more difficult to contemplate or execute. What disturbed me most about this new existence was how easily I had begun to adapt to circumstances that should have been unbearable, finding myself engaging in detailed discussions about money laundering techniques and offshore banking strategies with the kind of professional interest that had once been reserved for legitimate financial investigations. Dante was an engaging conversationalist when he chose to be, with a broad knowledge of history and literature that made our working relationship feel more like an intellectual collaboration than a hostage situation, and I caught myself forgetting for hours at a time that the charming man sharing insights about Renaissance banking practices was the same person who had ordered Maria Santos's execution and disposal in the East River. The cognitive dissonance was exhausting and disorienting, creating a psychological whiplash between moments of genuine engagement with the intellectual challenges he presented, and sharp reminders of the horrific reality underlying everything we discussed, like when he would casually mention that a particular associate had been dealt with after skimming from drug proceeds, or when I would discover surveillance photographs of Maya mixed in with financial documents as a not-so-subtle reminder of what my continued cooperation was purchasing. These jarring transitions between civilized discourse and veiled threats kept me constantly off balance and uncertain about how to navigate the increasingly complex emotional landscape of my captivity. The evening that would change everything began like many others, with Dante and me working late in the library, while he explained the intricacies of a particularly sophisticated cryptocurrency laundering operation that involved routing funds through a maze of shell companies and digital wallets before emerging as clean investments in legitimate startups and venture capital funds. His enthusiasm for the elegance of the scheme was genuine and infectious, and I found myself impressed, despite my moral reservations, by the creativity and technical sophistication that went into moving hundreds of millions of dollars through the global financial system, without leaving traces that could be followed by law enforcement agencies. The attack, when it came, was swift and professionally executed, with masked gunmen bursting through the library's French doors like shadows given substance and malevolent intent, their automatic weapons trained on us with the kind of steady precision that spoke of extensive military training and combat experience. The sound of shattering glass and splintering wood filled the air as they destroyed everything in their path, and I found myself diving behind the massive oak desk while bullets chewed through priceless books and artwork with indiscriminate fury. The acrid smell of gunpowder mixing with the scent of leather and old paper to create an olfactory signature that would haunt my dreams for months afterward. Dante's response to this invasion was immediate and utterly without fear, his body moving with the fluid grace of someone who had faced mortal danger countless times before, as he produced a pistol from somewhere within his suit jacket and began returning fire with calm, methodical precision that was terrifying in its effectiveness. The contrast between the cultured gentleman who had been discussing medieval banking practices just moments before and the stone-cold killer who now moved through the chaos with deadly efficiency was so stark that it took my breath away and forced me to confront the reality of who and what I had been living with for the past 3 weeks. The firefight that followed seemed to last forever, but probably consumed only a few minutes of real time, with muzzle flashes strobing through the smoke-filled air and the deafening crash of gunfire echoing off the library's high ceilings until my ears rang and my vision blurred from the sensory overload. Through it all, Dante moved like a dancer through the destruction, using the heavy furniture for cover while picking off attackers with shots that found their targets with surgical precision. And I realized that whatever else he might be, he was also a soldier who had honed his skills in conflicts that had prepared him for exactly this kind of urban warfare. When the shooting finally stopped and the smoke began to clear, revealing the carnage that had transformed the elegant library into a battlefield strewn with bodies and debris, I expected Dante to be focused on securing the area and assessing the damage to his property and personnel. Instead, his first concern was for my safety and well-being, his hands gentle but urgent as he checked me for injuries and guided me away from the worst of the destruction. His voice soft and reassuring as he spoke words of comfort that seemed to come from a different person entirely than the one who had just killed 3 men without apparent emotion or regret. The tenderness in his touch as he brushed glass fragments from my hair and cleaned a small cut on my cheek was so unexpected and genuine that it broke through the emotional barriers I had been carefully maintaining throughout my captivity, releasing a flood of conflicted feelings that I had been struggling to suppress and deny. The adrenaline coursing through my system seemed to amplify every sensation and emotion, making me hyper-aware of his proximity and the way his steel-gray eyes had softened with what appeared to be genuine concern for my welfare, rather than the calculated manipulation I had come to expect from our interactions. When he pulled me against his chest in what should have been a simple gesture of comfort and protection, the combination of adrenaline, emotional exhaustion, and the intoxicating scent of his cologne created a perfect storm of desire and confusion that overwhelmed my rational mind and obliterated the careful distance I had been maintaining between us. The kiss that followed was inevitable and devastating, containing 3 weeks' worth of suppressed tension and conflicted emotions compressed into a single moment of passionate surrender that left me breathless and trembling in his arms, while my conscience screamed warnings that I was no longer capable of hearing over the thundering of my pulse in my ears. The horror of realizing that I was not only capable of feeling desire for my captor, but was actively responding to his touch with an enthusiasm that betrayed everything I thought I knew about my own moral character, was almost overwhelming. But the evidence was undeniable, as his hands roamed my body with possessive urgency, and I found myself pressing against him with a desperate need that had nothing to do with coercion, and everything to do with a genuine attraction that I had been fighting to deny since the first moment I saw him in that courtroom. The knowledge that I was falling in love with a murderer should have been enough to shock me back to my senses, but instead, it only seemed to intensify the passionate fire that was consuming my resistance and my carefully constructed sense of right and wrong. As we moved together in the aftermath of violence, surrounded by the evidence of his capacity for brutality, but lost in the gentleness of his touch and the surprising vulnerability I glimpsed in his eyes when he thought I wasn't looking, I understood that I had crossed a line from which there could be no return, that whatever happened next would be colored by this moment of surrender and the terrible knowledge that my heart had chosen to betray my mind in the most dangerous way possible. The discovery of my carefully hidden evidence files 3 days after our passionate encounter in the library should have meant my death. And as I sat bound to a chair in Dante's private office while he methodically reviewed every document, every photograph, and every meticulously compiled piece of evidence I had gathered against his organization during my weeks of captivity, I found myself strangely calm in the face of what seemed like inevitable execution, perhaps because the emotional upheaval of falling in love with my captor had already shattered so many of my fundamental assumptions about myself that the prospect of dying seemed almost anticlimactic compared to the psychological devastation I had already endured. The manila folders spread across his massive mahogany desk contained months of work that I had somehow managed to accomplish, despite the constant surveillance and limited access to outside communications, documenting money laundering operations, political corruption networks, and the intricate web of violence that held his criminal empire together, all compiled with the forensic accountant's attention to detail that had defined my professional life before it was consumed by this nightmare of moral compromise and unwanted desire. What shocked me more than his discovery of my betrayal was the expression on his face as he read through my documentation. Not the cold fury I had expected from someone who had just learned that his supposed ally had been systematically gathering evidence to destroy him, but rather something that looked almost like admiration, mixed with a sadness that seemed to run deeper than mere disappointment at being deceived by someone he had grown to trust. The silence stretched between us for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, broken only by the soft whisper of turning pages and the distant sound of his men moving through the house as they conducted their own investigation into how I had managed to compile such damning evidence under their very noses. "You know," Dante said finally, his voice carrying the same conversational tone he had used when discussing literature or philosophy during our long evenings in the library. "I've been aware of your activities since the second week you were here, and I've been watching with considerable interest as you built this remarkably comprehensive case against me and everything I've worked to create over the past 15 years. His words hit me like a physical blow, not because they revealed the futility of my efforts, which I had always known was likely, but because they confirmed that our growing intimacy had been based on yet another layer of deception and manipulation, that even my rebellion against his control had been anticipated and allowed to continue for his own mysterious purposes. The revelation that he had known about my investigation all along forced me to reevaluate every interaction we had shared, every moment of apparent vulnerability and genuine connection that had led me to believe I was seeing glimpses of the man beneath the monster. And I realized with growing horror that I had been playing a game where only one of us understood the rules, while the other stumbled blindly toward a predetermined outcome. The photographs and financial records that had taken me weeks to secretly compile and copy were evidence not of my cleverness or determination, but of his willingness to let me think I was striking back at him while he maintained complete control over every aspect of my existence, including my futile attempts at resistance and rebellion. "The truly fascinating part," Dante continued, settling into the chair across from me with the relaxed posture of someone conducting a pleasant business meeting rather than interrogating a potential spy, "is that approximately 60% of the information you gathered was deliberately fed to you through channels I established specifically for that purpose, designed to help you build cases against the corrupt FBI agents and federal judges who have been skimming profits from our operations while providing increasingly unreliable protection in return." His words reframed everything I thought I knew about my investigation, transforming what I had believed was evidence of his guilt into proof of an even more complex and morally ambiguous situation where the lines between criminal and victim had been blurred beyond recognition. The implications of what he was telling me were staggering and disorienting, suggesting that my efforts to gather evidence against him had somehow been turned into a weapon against other corrupt officials who had betrayed their oaths of office in service of greed and self-interest, making me an unwilling participant in a shadow war between different factions of criminals and corrupt law enforcement that existed in the gray areas between legal and illegal, moral and immoral. The realization that I had been manipulated into helping him eliminate threats from within the very system I had hoped would bring him to justice was almost too complex and devastating to fully comprehend, forcing me to confront the possibility that nothing in my experience over the past month had been what it appeared to be on the surface. "You see, Sarah," Dante said, using my first name with an intimacy that sent unwanted shivers down my spine, despite everything I now knew about his capacity for deception and control. "Your courage in testifying against me, despite the obvious danger it represented to your personal safety, demonstrated a kind of moral integrity that I had begun to think no longer existed in the world I inhabit, and it made me want to discover whether that integrity could survive contact with the brutal realities of the system you thought you were serving." His explanation for the elaborate psychological torture he had subjected me to was delivered with the same thoughtful consideration, he might have used to analyze a complex financial transaction, as if my emotional devastation and moral compromise were simply interesting data points in some twisted experiment he was conducting on the nature of human corruption and redemption. The sound of gunfire erupting from somewhere else in the house interrupted whatever twisted confession or justification he had been building toward, and the sudden tension in his body language told me that this interruption was neither planned nor welcome, that whatever control he had been exercising over our situation had just been shattered by forces that operated outside his carefully constructed scenarios. The look that passed between us in that moment contained layers of communication that words could never have conveyed. An acknowledgement that despite everything that had happened between us, despite the deception and manipulation and moral compromise, there was something genuine that had grown in the space between predator and prey that neither of us had expected or fully understood. When his second-in-command, Alexei, burst through the office doors with blood on his shirt and panic in his eyes, followed immediately by armed men whose faces I didn't recognize, and whose body language suggested hostile rather than friendly intent, I realized that the complex game Dante had been playing with my life and emotions had just been interrupted by players who operated by much simpler and more violent rules. The betrayal was swift and efficiently executed, with Alexei stepping aside to allow the gunman clear shots at his former boss, while explaining in rapid Russian that the Morozov family had decided to eliminate the Kozlov operation entirely, rather than continue negotiating territorial boundaries and profit-sharing arrangements. The moment of choice that followed lasted only seconds in real time, but stretched like an eternity in my consciousness, as I realized that the man who had destroyed and remade my entire understanding of myself and the world around me was about to be executed while I sat helpless in my bonds, and that I could either watch him die and hope that his killers would show me mercy, or I could somehow intervene in a situation that was almost certain to result in my own death regardless of the outcome. The rational, survival-oriented part of my mind screamed that I should remain silent and still, that this was my chance to escape from the nightmare that had consumed my life and return to some semblance of normalcy and safety. But the part of me that had somehow learned to love this dangerous and complicated man refused to let him face death alone. The letter opener on his desk was small and inadequate compared to the automatic weapons trained on both of us, but it was sharp enough to cut through the ropes binding my wrists, and the element of surprise was sufficient to let me drive the improvised weapon deep into Alexei's neck before anyone could react to stop me, sending him stumbling backward while arterial blood sprayed across the Persian carpet and expensive suits of his co-conspirators. The chaos that followed was brief and violent, with Dante somehow producing weapons from hidden compartments I had never suspected existed, while I threw myself behind his desk and tried to avoid the crossfire that turned his elegant office into a battlefield as deadly as the library had been just days earlier. When the smoke cleared and the last echoes of gunfire faded into silence, we were alone again among the bodies and debris, both of us wounded but alive, both of us staring at each other across a room that had been transformed from a symbol of refined power into evidence of the brutal reality that underlay everything beautiful in his world. The knowledge that I had chosen him over safety, that I had killed to protect someone who had manipulated and controlled me, should have filled me with shame and regret. But instead I felt only a strange sense of completion, as if I had finally stopped fighting against the current that had been carrying me toward this moment since the first time our eyes met across a courtroom. I testified against an unknown man and lost my old life forever, I whispered, as he pulled me into his arms among the carnage we had created together, his blood mixing with mine as we held each other in the ruins of everything we had built and destroyed. But in the ashes, I found something infinitely more dangerous than any criminal empire. I found home in the heart of a killer who would burn the world to keep me safe, and discovered that love is not about choosing between good and evil, but about finding someone worth becoming a monster for, someone who sees the darkness in your soul and calls it beautiful. The reflection of flames from the burning curtains danced in his steel-gray eyes as he kissed me with desperate passion. And I understood finally that some transformations cannot be undone. That some choices change us so fundamentally that there is no path back to who we used to be, only the terrible and exhilarating freedom of embracing who we have become.